Hi there and welcome back to the channel. So in today's video we are going to continue our clean architecture series, and we'll be looking at something we called use cases, right? So all this while what we've been doing may seem complex if you are not used to it, and you may think, why don't we just write a function in our controller or in our provider, depending on which state management you are using, that does all this? Because this is becoming complex as time goes on. There's too much abstraction here. You have to call this method call this, like this, right? Yeah, but then when you look at it critically, it makes sense because we have an app that has a lot of features, right? In this particular case, we have just a to-do feature. That's the only feature our app has. But in case we want to extend this app or make it big for mass use, we may add another feature like authentication, or maybe sharing of files, sharing of to-do, even chat or whatsoever. You get it? And we can't be writing all these functionalities in our controllers. Okay, so that's the reason why we have this structure that we have. And if I say it makes sense, it will even make more sense when I introduce the use case. So it's more like this: you have a button in your UI, right? And the user wants to perform a particular function like send a message, add a to-do, add an item to cart, right? So that's the action the user wants to perform. The user doesn't really care about which database you are saving your to-do or cart, or how you are managing your stuff. The user doesn't care. So what the user sees is a button. So when it comes to a use case refers to a specific action or functionality that the user can perform within an application. It represents a logical unit of work that an application can perform in response to a user's request or an event. So that's a use case, right? So if you look at this adding of to do doesn't really concern the user. The user doesn't care if we are calling a remote database.add to do or whatever. The user just wants to add to do. So the specific task the user wants to perform is our use case. That's the functionality we've exposed to the interface of the app. You get it? Because a particular button may perform a lot of functionalities behind the hood, but the user may just see it as a single button, right? The user may not know that pressing on this button calls a function that calls another method that does a lot of checks before whatever he wants to achieve is being achieved. All that the user cares is he presses a button, that thing works. But in our case, we have to structure our code in such a way that we are abstracting all this complexity from our interface. So the user just sees a button, he presses on it, that button calls a use case, and the use case refers to an action or function that the user can trigger. So the user sees a button, adding a to do, that user presses the button, it calls our use case. Now what is our use case going to do? So our use case is now coming to call the respective repository. So we have a to-do repository here. We are going to have a use case. We're not going to call this to-do repository directly. We don't want the interface, that's the front end, to have access to this feature, either failure, blah 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 blah. No. So what we do is we represent the front end or our presentation layer with a use case, right? We like, if we want to add a to-do, we've abstracted all these functionalities away from you. We have a use case, just call that use case. Now that use case is what you have to call, or that use case is what is accessible to the user. A single use case can perform a lot of functions. So we can have a use case, a simple use case like send message, right? But then that send message must check if the user is online, must check the recipient, must do a lot of things before the sending of the message goes through. In simple terms, as I've explained, we need a use case, right? And that use case is the action the user performs in our app. This may not make a lot of sense because we are dealing just one feature over here, and the feature is adding a to do or deleting a to do. It's more like around to dos. So you may think, why do we even need a use case when we can just call our repository directly? But when you get more features in your app, right, you start to appreciate why we need a use case. Not talking too much, I would want to show you guys an example of a use case. So within our domain entities, we created a directory called use case, and these are going to be all the functionalities we are going to expose, right? So I'm going to create one called add, I'm just going to name the file add.dat, and this file is going to contain the function that calls our repository, calls the respective repository for add new to do, right? And that repository has already been implemented somewhere. So we can have a class, and you can name it anything you want. So add to do, because this is just a demo, I want to keep the name use case so that you don't get confused. So add to do use case, right? And this add to do use case will take in our repository. So we create a method called call, right? So it means when we call this add to do use case, what do we want to do? We want to call our repository.add to do and pass in the to do, and our repository.add to do will call our database, and then the to do will go through. So it's more like someone taps on the button and the button triggers a use case, then the use case calls a repository, then the repository calls the database, and then that's the flow. Our to do gets to the database, right? Now in our app, all use cases are going to follow a particular pattern. The use case may take in some parameters, right, and it may return some results, and that is going to be the structure of all use cases. So when a user performs an action, you may take some input from the user and then you may return a result. You may take an input from the user and you may return a result, or sometimes you may not take an input, sometimes you may return any result, right? So there must be a generic structure for a use case, so that we know that for every use case we can either pass in a parameter and then expect some results, or we are passing in nothing and we are expecting nothing, right? So in order for that structure to be enforced, I'm going to my shared folder and I'm going to create a new folder called utils, and within that utils I'm going to create a file called use case dot that, right? And this is going to be an abstract class, and I'm going to call it use case, right? So we are saying that we have an abstract class called use case, and this use case takes in a type and a parameter. Now the type is what we are expecting to be returned, right? So for instance, if you are adding a to do, what are we returning? We are returning the to do. The parameter is what will be passed to the core method. So you realize that we have a core method here, and when you come to the add, we're also calling we have a core method here, right? So we are going to extend the generic use case, or we are going to implement the generic use case, and then we are going to override the core method to do whatever we are doing over here. If it sounds complex, then let me demonstrate it to you. So we've created an abstract class that takes in a type, right, as in a generic, and then it also takes in the params. Now we are having a method in this class, which that method is not anything that you've not seen before, because I've talked about this either failure and then something in the past. So we are saying that we have some method called call. That method is expected to return either a failure, which is a class we created, or the type we are passing in. That's the type we are expecting it to return. Now when we call that call method, we are passing as some params that we had from this use case as an implementation. So let's use this use case so that you guys have a fair idea of how to use it. So in our add to do use case, this is going to implement our generic use case like this. So let me import this use case here. Let me import this. Good. Now we have a class called add to do use case that implements our use case. Now because all the types here are the same, it might confuse you a bit, but we are saying that we have a use case, right? And the use case takes in a type, which is what we want to return, and a params, which is what we want to pass to this use case, right? So the user taps on the button to add a to do, Tapping on the button triggers a use case, because a use case, as I've explained, is the action the user can perform in our app. Now, what do you want to pass to this use case when the user taps on the add to do button? We want to pass a to do. What are we returning from this use case to the user or to the front end? We are returning the to do the user created, and this structure is because of how we implemented our repository. You could return void or null or whatsoever you want to return here, even the ID of the to do, right? They only seem the same because of how we made our to do repository. So if I take you there, you realize we are returning a to do, right? If everything goes on well, we are returning a to do, and if there is an error, we are returning a failure. So we are passing a to do and we are expecting a to do back. Now this is what we are expecting back, right? But for this use case, any class that implements this use case must override the core method. So we are overriding the core method. Definition of the core method is that it is a method that has a return type of future, either failure or to do. Takes in some to do and then return something. So what are we returning? We are calling our repository.add and we are passing the to do that we had. Now, so this is just a to do, add to do use case, right? And it's going to be similar for all the other use cases. As your project grows, you may want to abstract these params, right? So you don't want to be passing in the class directly to the params. So you may create another class, or abstract class, or whatever class you would want, and then maybe call it params, which will take in the type you want. So the to do, right? In that case, you wouldn't have to do here as you are seeing here, but we are going to pass that to do to the params, and then as we saw in the implementation of the core method, right, we are going to pass in that params to this core method. Over here, this to do and this to do are the same. That's why our compiler is not complaining. So it's assuming there is a params and this is the params. But as time goes on, as your project grows, or if you're working on a much bigger project, you may create an abstraction for the params so that you pass in the to do as a param, and then you accept it here as a param. Then you call your repository.add, passing the to do, and this is going to return something, right? So this add over here will return as a to do, and the same structure that we have over here. So basically a use case is not anything complex, right? As I've explained, a use case refers to a specific action or functionality that a user can perform within an application. It also represents a logical unit of work that an application can perform in response to a user's request or event. In other words, you're not going to expose your repositories to your front end directly. You must have some operations that you think your front end needs to perform. So those are the only operations your front end needs to perform. So you expose those operations in the form of use case to your front end. Then your front end calls those use cases. When your front end calls those use cases, it's up to you to decide whatever you want to do with that use case. Either to call a repository that calls another repository and calls a database, or makes a network request, whatever you want to do, it's up to you. But then that's the whole idea of having a use case. It's just another layer that your front end communicates with, right? And when I talk of your front end, I'm just talking of your presentation layer, what the user sees. That's just a little explanation of use case. In the next video, we'll look at how to implement all the use cases and then call it from our front end. We wouldn't be able to build our front end out or use our front end if we don't have a use case. Or we can, but then that will mean we are not following the right architecture structure, right? So if you don't get anything, you can leave a comment down below in the comment section, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.